Ever feel like you've got like a whole committee meeting going on inside your head?
Oh,
You
definitely.
know, one voice wants that pizza, another shouting about the diet.
Right. That internal argument
Yeah.
happens all the time.
Well, that back and forth, those kind of distinct voices, psychology actually has a name for that feeling, doesn't it? It's this idea of the dialogical self.
Exactly. For a long time, the thinking was, the self is just one single thing, unified.
Right.
But dialogical self theory, or DST, which Hubert Herman's really pioneered, paints a much more dynamic picture. It suggests our minds are, well, more like bustling inner societies,
Yeah.
populated by different self-positions that can actually talk to each other, have dialogues.
Okay, interesting. So let's really unpack this in our deep dive today. We're planning to explore these internal conversations. We'll be looking at the Wikipedia page for a good foundation on DST,
Good starting point.
and then a really interesting report that investigates how this plays out in journaling, both the old school way and with AI assistance.
Yeah, that's a fascinating angle.
And finally, a research article that digs into how these inner dialogues compare to something else we often talk about, self-talk.
Ah, the distinction there is key.
So the goal for you listening is to really get a grasp on this complex inner world and maybe explore how different techniques, including, yeah, some new tech, might help us understand ourselves better.
Precisely. It's about going beyond just acknowledging those voices,
Hmm.
understanding what they are, how they interact, and really why it all matters for self-awareness and personal growth.
Okay, let's dive right in then. This dialogical self-theory, DST. What's the core idea?
So at its heart, Herman's theory says the mind isn't this single solid block. It's more like, well, Marvin Minsky called it a society of mind.
Okay.
Within this inner society, you have numerous self-positions. Now, think of these as different facets of you.
Like roles.
Exactly. Roles like parent, friend, professional. Also, your identities. Maybe you see yourself as an artist or an athlete, even significant people or groups in your life that you've kind of internalized.
Mm.
And these different positions, they can actually have dialogical relationships. They can interact.
So it's not just me thinking about being a parent and then separately thinking about my job. It's like the parent me and the work me could actually be having a chat inside my head.
That's it, exactly. And the theory goes even further with this idea of the extended self,
Extend itself.
meaning the self isn't just stuck inside your skull. It includes those internal positions like I as a reader or I as someone learning guitar, but also external positions.
External, like people.
People, groups that matter to you, your family, your colleagues, maybe your sports team, they become, in a sense, part of your extended self.
Wow, okay. That's a big way to think about it. So if my internal work self is stressed, maybe the internalized voice of my supportive spouse pops up, even if they're not there.
Perfect example.
Mm.
That shows how the other isn't just outside us.
Mhm.
They can become an other in the self.
Right.
And this leads to some really interesting stuff, like internal conflicts, right? Your spontaneous self wants to book a trip. Your sensible planning self hits the brakes.
There.
Or conflicts between internal and external. You want a career change, but the internalized voice of, say, a cautious parent is raising objections.
Mm.
And even within the external stuff, how different people in your actual team interact can shape how you act within that team's context.
It sounds like a really complex inner ecosystem. So what happens when these different positions clash?
Well, DST makes a distinction between monological and dialogical relationships within the self.
Okay, monological versus dialogical.
In monological relationships, it's like one self position grabs the microphone and silences the others. One voice dominates.
Ah, like
know.
a dictatorship.
Sort of, yeah. Whereas dialogical relationships involve recognizing, accepting the differences, even the otherness of these various positions, both internal and external,
So letting them all have a say.
pretty much.
Mm.
And when that happens, there's more potential for the self and even the external relationships to evolve, find new solutions. Just noticing when one voice is shouting down the others can be the first step towards a healthier inner conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. Like if I always ignore my need for rest because my productive self calls it lazy,
Right.
that's monological.
Exactly.
But if I can hear both and maybe negotiate, that's dialogical. And probably better for me.
Definitely better long term. Now, this whole idea, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It has some really important historical roots.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Two key thinkers who really influenced DST were William James and Mikhail Bakhtin.
William James.
Yeah.
The stream of consciousness guy.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Way back in 1890, James made this crucial distinction between the I and the me.
I and me. Okay.
The I is the self as knower. The part of you that's aware, experiencing things right now, it has that sense of continuity, being distinct, having free will. The me, though, that's the self as known, all the stuff you think of as part of you. And this is where it connects to DST, because James argued the me goes way beyond just our body or thoughts.
How so?
It includes our clothes, our home, our family, friends, our reputation, our possessions, basically anything you can call mine.
Wow.
This idea of the self stretching out beyond the individual skin, that was a huge precursor to Herman's thinking about self-positions.
So my beat-up old armchair, if it feels like mine, it's technically part of my extended me.
According to James, yeah, it contributes to your empirical self. He even suggested that my enemy could be part of this extended self. It really stretches how we define self.
It really does. Okay, and you mentioned Mikhail Bakhtin. He's more literary theory, isn't he?
Correct. Bakhtin, a Russian literary theorist, came up with this powerful metaphor, the polyphonic novel. He looked particularly at Dostoevsky's work.
Polyphonic, like many voices.
Exactly. Yeah. He argued that in Dostoevsky's novels, it's not just Dostoevsky's single authorial voice controlling everything. Instead, you have multiple independent voices or thinkers, the characters. Think Raskolnikov or Prince Mishkin. They aren't just puppets for Dostoevsky. They have their own distinct worldviews, their own ideas, and they engage in real dialogue, often clashing, presenting different perspectives.
Wow, so play where the characters have genuine disagreements, not just reciting the author's lines?
Precisely. Each character has their own ideology, Bakhtin said. They're not just passive objects. It's a multitude of consciousnesses in dialogue, like a piece of music with several independent melodic lines weaving together.
That's a great analogy.
And this idea, this multiplicity of perspectives within one work, was a huge inspiration for thinking about multiple voices within oneself.
So Hermans and his colleagues, Kempen and Van Loon, they basically pulled these threads together from James and Bakhtin.
That's a good way to put it. In their foundational work, they really conceptualized the self as this dynamic multiplicity of relatively autonomous I positions.
Okay.
Moving around the mind's landscape. The I, that core awareness, can shift its viewpoint from one position to another depending on the situation, the time.
So I can look from the perspective of the parent self and then shift to look from the friend self.
Exactly. It can move between opposing views, give each position a voice. This allows for those internal dialogues, questions, answers, agreements, disagreements, very much like Bakhtin's characters. Each voice tells its own story from its own angle, contributing to this complex, narratively structured self.
Okay, so we've got this really rich idea of the self as a sort of internal society. How do psychologists actually, study this? How do they explore this inner world? Are there specific tools?
Absolutely. Because DST gives us this framework, researchers have developed various ways to assess and investigate it. One key tool is the Personal Position Repertoire Method, or PPR. Herman's developed this.
Personal Position Repertoire.
It's very personalized. An individual gets a list of potential internal positions like I is ambitious or I is anxious, and external ones, my boss, my best friend.
Mm-hmm.
They pick the ones that resonate.
And add their own, too.
Yes, they can add their own unique ones. Then they fill out this matrix showing how important each internal position feels in relation to each external one.
So mapping the connections.
Exactly. It helps visualize which internal voices are loudest or most active in different relationship contexts. You can analyze it statistically, see which positions are generally most important, or use it qualitatively. The person can tell stories linked to specific positions and explore the dialogues between them.
That sounds really detailed, like creating a personalized map of someone's inner landscape. What else is there?
Another approach is the personality web, developed by Raggett. This assumes the self is built from opposing narrative voices, each with its own backstory and attachments. Yeah, attachments to people, events, objects, even parts of the self. The assessment involves identifying these attachments, exploring their history and meaning, and then using stats to map the person's unique network of these. So it's not just naming the voices, but understanding what matters to each one and how they're all linked up.
It's like figuring out the alliances and maybe rivalries within the inner committee.
Exactly. Then there's the self-confrontation method, or SCM. This is often used therapeutically.
Okay.
You ask a client to explore a conflict or experience from the perspective of different self-positions. The Wikipedia page had that powerful example. A client who sometimes felt like a witch with harmful thoughts.
Right, I remember reading that.
She was asked to tell stories about her life, past, present, future, from both her usual self and from the witch perspective. The narratives were hugely different, revealing a very one-sided monological relationship.
So no dialogue between those parts.
Exactly. And through therapy and journaling, she was able to understand and integrate these parts better, moving towards a more dialogical relationship internally.
That really shows how bringing these dialogues out can actually lead to change. Are there also more quantitative ways, like questionnaires?
Yes. Piotr Ole and his colleagues developed something called the initial questionnaire. This tries to measure three things: how often you shift perspective internally, how much internal monologue you have, that running commentary.
Yeah, the voice just narrating things.
Right. And how much internal dialogue those back and forth exchanges. People look at a list of potential positions and indicate which ones feature in their inner conversations and offer new viewpoints.
And what did they find with that?
Some interesting correlations. For instance, people who reported more frequent inner dialogues tended to score higher on imagination and openness, but also on self-consciousness, compared to those who mainly had monologues.
Huh. That's a fascinating link between inner chat style and personality. And you mentioned one more, dialogical sequence analysis.
Yes, that came from Lehman, building on Bakhtin again. The core idea is that every utterance, even internal ones, is aimed at an intended listener.
Even when you're just thinking to yourself.
The analysis suggests, yes, we might think it's just us, but there can be multiple others, real or imagined, influencing how we structure our internal speech. By analyzing the patterns, researchers try to identify these implicit addressees.
So even a private thought might be shaped by who we imagine we're talking to, or maybe arguing against in our head.
That's the idea. So all these methods, PPR, Personality Web, SEM, the questionnaire, sequence analysis, offer different but complementary ways to explore this incredibly complex dialogical self.
Okay, that gives us a good sense of the research side. But how can people listening actually engage with these ideas more practically? You mentioned the dialogue technique earlier.
Right, the dialogue technique. This is basically a hands-on method for interacting with these different parts of yourself.
How does it work?
It involved intentionally engaging in conversation with various aspects of your inner world. You might talk to your inner child, your inner critic, your wiser self, whichever parts feel active or relevant.
So actively starting a conversation.
Yes, it's a direct application of that core DST idea. The self is multifaceted, and dialogue between these parts can boost self-understanding and help process emotions. It's like deliberately setting up a meeting with that inner perfectionist who's always on your case.
I could probably use that. The report we looked at mentioned this technique has roots in a few different psychological approaches.
It does. It draws from internal family systems, or IFS.
Oh yeah, IFS, with the different parts of the mind.
Exactly. IFS sees the mind as having multiple parts, each with its own feelings and needs, and the goal is harmony between them. It also connects to Jungian psychology, integrating archetypes like the shadow, and Gestalt therapy.
The empty chair technique.
That's a classic example. Using an empty chair to represent another person or other part of yourself and talking to it. The overall aim of the dialogue technique, drawing on these, is integrating these different parts for personal growth.
It sounds really proactive. Now, that report explored using this technique in traditional journaling versus AI. Let's start with traditional journaling. How does that typically look?
In traditional journaling, you'd usually write out the conversations. Literally script them.
Okay.
You might use prompts to get started, like, what does my anxious self need right now? Or, what advice would my future self give me? By giving each part a distinct voice on the page, you can start to see the underlying emotions and conflicts more clearly.
So it's not just venting, it's structuring the dialogue.
Right. It's more than just writing about your thoughts. It's creating a dialogue between them.
The report mentioned a specific exercise, the journal dialogue.
Yes. It often starts with a little quiet time, just to center yourself. Then you pick a topic, maybe an emotion you're wrestling with, or a decision. You start a written conversation, often using what questions, what are you afraid of, rather than why are you afraid? Because what tends to open things up more.
Less accusatory, maybe.
Exactly. Then you respond as the different parts, really trying to adopt their perspective. The suggestion was to aim for at least, say, 25 minutes in a quiet space.
That sounds like it could be really powerful. There was an example, dialogue between an inner critic and a compassionate self.
Yeah, that's a common one. The inner critic might list failures, be harsh. The compassionate self responds with understanding, offers balance, maybe highlights effort or strengths. Writing it out helps you see the critical patterns, maybe where they come from, and strengthens that kinder voice by giving it space.
Makes sense. And the benefits mentioned were things like clarity, emotional processing, self-awareness.
All contributing to personal growth, yeah.
Yeah.
But the report also noted challenges, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like actually accessing those parts sometimes.
Definitely. Some parts might be harder to reach, maybe more defended, and just consistency. Like any practice, sticking with journaling can be tough when life gets busy. It takes commitment.
Okay, now let's switch gears to the AI side. AI audio journaling. How is the dialogue technique being adapted there?
So AI audio journaling takes that core idea, conversing with self parts, but makes it spoken, and adds interaction with AI.
So instead of writing, you talk.
You talk. You record your reflections, maybe speaking as your frustrated self. Then the AI might offer prompts or feedback designed to encourage more dialogue.
How would that work?
Well, the AI could ask a follow-up question, maybe framed from the perspective of a different part, like a problem-solving part. Okay, you're frustrated. What's one small step you could take? Something like that.
Ah, okay, so it makes it more interactive.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And maybe more accessible for people who prefer talking to writing or want to reflect while, commuting or walking.
That could be useful. The report mentions some tools or features. How do they help the self-dialogue?
Some platforms offer personalized prompts based on what you said before, nudging you to explore different angles. Others might analyze your spoken entries, maybe highlight recurring themes or emotional tones.
Like you seem to mention feeling overwhelmed quite often.
Exactly. And that observation could then prompt you to engage in a dialogue about that feeling. The AI acts as a kind of interactive mirror, reflecting things back and prompting more exploration.
So the AI is almost like a facilitator for the internal chat.
In a way, yeah. It can offer those starter questions or suggest perspectives you might not have considered, guiding you towards parts of yourself you weren't focused on. It's a different dynamic than traditional journaling, where you're driving the whole process yourself.
That is a really interesting difference. But the report also raised some potential downsides or things to keep in mind with AI.
Yeah, a few important points. While these tools offer convenience and new ways to engage, you have to be mindful of limitations.
Like what?
Well, the depth of understanding, the empathy, and AI might not fully grasp the nuances of complex human emotions the way another person, or even just your own deep reflection might.
Right, it's code, not consciousness.
Exactly. And the potential for those really deep, unexpected insights that can come from unguided reflection or working with a therapist, that might be different in an AI interaction. There are also always privacy considerations, although many platforms use encryption. And maybe a risk of over-relying on the tech instead of developing your own internal listening skills.
So it's not necessarily that one is better, but they offer different things, different strengths, different limitations.
I think that's the right way to look at it. Traditional journaling gives you that deep, solitary space. AI audio journaling might be a more interactive, maybe easier entry point for some, or a useful add-on. It depends on what you're looking for.
This is definitely giving me food for thought about my own internal world. Now, shifting to that research article. It looked at inner dialogue versus self-talk. What was the key difference they were working with?
Okay, so the researchers define self-talk pretty much as we usually think of it, that internal monologue instructions we give ourselves. Focus now or calm down,
Yeah.
often for self-regulation.
Got it.
Inner dialogical activity, though, they defined as those exchanges between different imagined figures or eye positions, exploring different perspectives, simulating conversations in your head.
So the key difference is one voice versus multiple voices interacting.
That's the main distinction they drew. Self-talk is often you talking to yourself. Sender recipients are the same. Inner dialogue involves a back and forth between different internal voices.
Okay, so reminding myself, gotta buy milk, is self-talk. But internally debating the pros and cons of asking for a raise with my confident self arguing with my anxious self, that's inner dialogue.
That's a perfect illustration.
Mm.
And they use specific tools to measure these. The self-talk scale, STS, looked at how often people use self-talk for things like self-criticism, self-encouragement, managing tasks, assessing social stuff.
The different functions of self-talk?
Right. And the internal dialogical activity scale revised, IDS, measured different types of inner dialogues. One's about identity, social interactions, changing perspective, even ruminative or supportive dialogues.
And they looked at how these two things, self-talk functions and inner dialogue types, were related.
Exactly. They studied students in Poland and the U.S., and they found quite a few significant positive links. Suggests there was overlap.
Like what kind of links?
Well, for example, people who scored high on self-critical self-talk also reported more intense and frequent maladaptive inner dialogues that aren't helpful.
That makes intuitive sense, like the same negative patterns showing up in both ways of talking to yourself.
Precisely.
Ah,
But their deeper statistical analysis, like factor analysis, also showed that while they overlap, they aren't identical.
so, related but distinct, not just different words for the same internal chatter.
That seems to be the takeaway.
Yeah.
The researchers proposed that maybe self-talk measured by the STS is more about actively coping with the here and now, directing behavior.
Like immediate self-management.
Yeah. Whereas inner dialogue, measured by IDSR, might be more reflective, more about wrestling with bigger questions of identity, relationships, possibilities, more contemplative.
Okay.
So they could be complementary ways we process things internally, one more action-oriented, the other more about meaning-making, perhaps.
That distinction really helps clarify how they fit together. Self-talk for the moment, inner dialogue for the deeper dives, maybe. Wow, this whole conversation really highlights just how busy and layered our inner world is. It's definitely not just one single voice in there.
Absolutely not. It's this dynamic, constantly shifting space with all these different perspectives. And engaging in these internal dialogues, whether we realize it or not, is just fundamental to being human. It's how we figure things out, make decisions, build who we are.
And as we've talked about today, becoming more aware of these inner dynamics, understanding them better, that seems like a really powerful path towards greater self-awareness, maybe better emotional balance, and definitely personal growth.
Couldn't agree more. And as we've seen, there are different ways to explore this landscape. You've got traditional journaling, the dialogue technique, or maybe exploring some of these AI audio journaling tools. The best approach for you listening is probably the one that resonates most, the one that fits your style and what you hope to gain.
Right. It's about finding what works. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. As you go about your day-to-day, maybe just pay a little more attention to those different voices inside. What are they saying? Who seems to be talking? And what might you actually learn if you consciously try to engage in a dialogue with them?
That's a great prompt.
It's a fascinating journey exploring that inner world, and hopefully this deep dive gave you some useful maps and tools for your own exploration.